Hi everyone, I am joined today by George Beebe, the former CIA Director of Russia Analysis and now the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you for coming on again.
Thanks for the invitation.
Well, not that long ago, Marco Rubio made a comment that the unipolar order, that is, global hegemony, had come to an end, and the world now consisted of multipolarity. That means, many great powers, and Washington had to therefore adjust its policies accordingly to, pursue its national interest, but also, of course, maximize its security. But how do you read this? Because it can become a bit abstract. What does the United States actually have to do to adjust from the unipolar order to the multipolar order?
Well, I think Secretary Rubio was exactly right. And I think this is really a watershed in American diplomatic history that we have a cabinet level official that's come right out and said what many people have long recognized, but which the U.S. government has never really acknowledged, that the the era of unipolarity that began after the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended is now over, and we're in a fundamentally different distribution of power in the world, one in which the United States is still, in many respects, the world's most capable and most powerful nation, but which has a number of peer and near peer rivals. And one big implication of that is, of course, is that the United States cannot simply coerce its way into advancing its agenda in the world. We're actually going to have to return to what for many centuries was a normal approach to international relations, one in which we have to balance power and we have to understand the role of diplomacy, which means that where national interests come into conflict, particularly between great powers that have nuclear weapons, we're actually going to have to find a way of balancing power and balancing interests so that we don't come into direct military conflict with these great powers, because unlike, for example, the world of the 19th century that was pre-nuclear, the implications of great power war today could be catastrophic for everybody involved. So the United States, which has not really conducted traditional diplomacy for the last 30 some years, is going to have to relearn an art that it once understood well, but has fallen into a little bit of disuse.
But the last time the world was multipolar, it was extremely Eurocentric, and one can also, well, not argue. I think it's well established that that Europe has been the priority for the United States, well, since its foundation. But given that in the new multipolar order, China will be one of the top two countries, how does this impact America's relationship to Europe? Do you see America, well, Europe being demoted to a second or a distant third, or how does this change, I guess, the transatlantic partnership? It's still preserved maybe, but more pragmatic. I'm not sure. How do you see this?
Well, the transatlantic partnership is going to have to change in some profound ways to accommodate some changes in the world that matter a lot. For one thing, if you're talking about a multipolar world order, Europe is going to have to be one of those poles. It needs to be one of those powers, because the United States by itself cannot serve as a sufficient counterweight to both Russian and Chinese power. We just lack the capacity and the focus to be able to do that. And to a great degree, the United States has pursued policies of twin hostility toward China and Russia in ways that drove them together to cooperate in the security realm much more closely than I think they otherwise would under more normal conditions. So that's going to have to change. But Europe is going to have to step up in a lot of ways. It has neglected the defense sector. It's basically outsourced its security to the United States for several decades. And that's been a pretty good deal for the Europeans. They were able to focus on promoting a high standard of living for their people. They didn't spend very much on defense, and they were content to know that the United States had their backs and they could afford to do all this. But the United States can no longer afford to be Europe's security subcontractor. We just lack the ability economically and militarily to do all of this. We have to prioritize in a world in which not only do we face more rivals, but the United States economy itself can no longer sustain unipolarity. It can no longer sustain a world in which we're attempting to advance American primacy to serve as the world's policeman, so to speak. And so Europe is going to have to step up. Now, part of this, of course, has to do with trade relations. After World War II, the United States found itself as by far the world's most capable, most powerful industrial manufacturer. That was in part due to America's own success in industrialization, but in part because we were more or less the last country left standing after World War II. But in circumstances like that, the United States had a vested national interest in being able to export its manufacturing products. So it had an interest in low barriers to trade. But over time, what happened was the United States lost its manufacturing capability. China has become by far the world's most powerful manufacturing power. The United States economy changed. It focused much more on finance and services and narrow information technology. But that hollowed out our middle class. It hollowed out our working class. We became increasingly unable to manufacture things like ships and even weapons. Other countries became dependent on the United States running very high trade deficits and essentially using credit to purchase the exports of other countries, including Europe. Europe was not particularly open to America's exports, but American markets were very much open to European exports. And that has to change. Part of what's going to have to go on is not just that Europe step up its own ability to defend itself and serve as a counterweight to some of the other powers to establish a balance in this multipolar order, but the nature of the trade relationship between Europe and the United States is going to have to change too. So this is going to be a period that's going to be quite disruptive as we seek a new equilibrium in the world, not just militarily between these powers, but also economically, where the terms of trade are going to have to change rather substantially.
Well, in Europe, many people have recognized that the debt levels in the United States is not sustainable. Yet, many are nonetheless taken by surprise that the U.S. has to take dramatic steps to reverse this. So it's it's an interesting situation. Before we logged on, I saw that J.D. Vance made a comment that the Europeans should not behave like vassals, that they had to learn to stand up for themselves, and they should even have pushed back against the United States when it invaded Iraq, as this could have avoided that disaster. So in other words, it's I was looking for indication for the Europeans becoming ready to pursue more autonomy, there, move out of America's basement, but now it appears we're being evicted from the basement. So it's an interesting development.
Well, another analogy one might use is we're taking off the training wheels
Yeah.
from the bicycle.
Well, maybe we have to be forced. I think it became too comfortable after all these decades under, the wings of the United States. I was also wanting to ask about what this means for the U.S.-Russia relationship, because, back in 2014, when the conflict began to break out, after the toppling of Yanukovych, and Russia annexed Crimea, then we saw that Henry Kissinger, he wrote that. He warned first that the whole idea that Russia had to be defeated was quite dangerous, as it put us on a very path to possible conflict or war. Now,
Mhm.
in his argument that if we recognize Russia to be a great power, which he did, then we have to see to what extent the core interest of the United States and Russia can be harmonized to, we'll see where it's possible to cooperate versus when it's necessary to go into a conflict. But how do you see the core interest of Russia now in the world? I guess in wider terms, its position in the world, but also to understand its position of in the Ukraine war. And just to expand the question further, can the Russian the demands or core interests be met by the United States?
Well, I think there's going to have to be a compromise between Russia and the West. The Russians can't get their maximalist goals. They can't get everything that they might ideally want. But at the same time, the United States is not going to be in a position to force Russian capitulation. And in a situation where neither side can get everything that it wants, you're going to have to find some middle ground, some compromise in which the core interests, the vital interests of all the parties are respected. Now, is that possible with Ukraine? Is it possible with the broader European security order? Because those two things are related. The war in Ukraine is what you might call a two-dimensional conflict. One dimension is between Russia and Ukraine over things that are essentially bilateral, where the borders are drawn, the treatment of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukrainian territory, levels of arms that each side holds and where they're positioned, those sorts of things. But the other dimension, and I would argue the more important dimension from the point of view of American national interest and geopolitics, is over the shape of Europe's security architecture. That's something that has been developing over the course of more than 30 years. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification, the question of what Europe's security order would look like in the post-Cold War period was a central matter for Russia, one that they grew increasingly frustrated over and then alarmed by, and eventually decided that they had to do something urgent about this, or they would find themselves facing a NATO-centric European security order that they were powerless to do anything about. They were not willing to allow that situation to coalesce. And so what I think has to happen here is there needs to be a broader compromise over Europe's security order. And that's going to involve things like recognizing that not all European states are going to be a part of the NATO alliance. There are going to have to be limits beyond which NATO will not expand. We're going to have to reaffirm some rules of the game that we once thought we had sorted out, but discovered that there was not, in fact, consensus over how to apply the rules of the game in Europe. We're going to have to address broader arms control questions so that there is a stable balance of power in Europe that also employ arms control measures, confidence and security building measures, crisis prevention measures that all have effectively fallen into disrepair of various kinds. All of that is going to be vital to establishing stability. Now, do the Russians want that in principle? I think in principle they do. Um, do the Europeans want this? That's a different question. I think there's a lot more reluctance in Europe to engage with Russia over these questions. Now, why is that? In part because there's a profound breakdown in trust on Russia's part toward Europe and on Europe's part toward Russia. That's part of it. Part of it, though, is the way the European Union is constructed and works. It's essentially a rule-setting organization. The European Union is good at nothing if not establishing rules and administering them bureaucratically out of Brussels. They're very comfortable operating in that area. And the notion that the Russians might have some voice in that Europe would have to take into account, I think is profoundly alarming to Europeans, particularly EU structures in Brussels. So there's not a lot of eagerness in Europe right now to try to find some compromise with Russia, try to find some way of bringing Russia back into European security discussions in some way. So the United States is in an interesting position here because the United States, for geopolitical reasons, believes that it needs détente with Russia. Where it's not a tenable situation for the United States, more or less by itself, with Europe as a vassal state, as J.D. Vance put it, to try to contend with the combined power of Russia and China working together. So one of the things that we need to do is the nature of the U.S.-Europe relationship has to change, but B, we need a better relationship with Russia, not to drive a wedge between Russia and China, because I don't think that's possible right now, but certainly to help the Russians gain more room for maneuver, to make them less dependent on China than they are. Because the degree of Russian dependence on China actually circumscribes Russia's own freedom of maneuver in the world. It's not a healthy situation from Russia's point of view, I don't believe, but it's also not a healthy situation for the United States in contending with this emerging multipolar order. We need Russia to be an independent pole in its own right, not simply a vassal of China. So can the United States pull this off? Can we, renegotiate the terms of trade in the world internationally? Can we achieve a more normal relationship with Russia, which in turn might facilitate a more normal relationship between Russia and China? And can we bring the Europeans around to recognizing that they're going to have to start standing up on their own 2 feet and play a role as a much more independent, albeit still American-friendly, pole in this emerging multipolar order? Those are hard things to pull off. This is a formidable challenge, but it's clear to me that the Trump administration knows what it's trying to achieve. I think it's got the diagnosis of the problem that it's facing correct. Now the question is, does it have the diplomatic skill to pull all of this off? That's going to be a formidable challenge.
Yeah, no, I agree from the perspective that the Americans and Russians actually have a lot in common, because neither wants Russia to become excessively dependent on China to the extent they feel compelled to follow China's policies. So again, if Russia wants to diversify its economic ties, which it says it does, and political partnerships, then this actually it shouldn't be that hard to. Well, a lot can be gained from normalizing relations. But on the Europeans, though, it's there's a huge reluctance to even discuss that NATO expansion could be even a challenge to Russia. I mean, this has been quite consistent for 30 years. As you said, the Russians we were quite worried that instead of removing the dividing lines of Europe, we just incrementally moved them to the east, which revived the zero-sum logic of the Cold War. And and especially along the dividing lines of Europe now, these deeply divided societies, be it Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, it's very easy for these domestic divisions to be exploited, I guess, in a divided Europe. But it doesn't seem in Europe that anyone is prepared to look at this. Indeed, it became normalized. We said, well, NATO represents European security. Russia's not part of NATO, so it kind of makes common sense that Russia should not have a veto, which should keep repeating over and over again. But it is strange because by that logic, Russia's not part of Europe. And so we have the largest country in Europe being the only one who shouldn't have a say. So you have countries like Estonia with 1.3 million people, and they have a seat at the table, but the Russians with their 145 million have no say. I mean, it's a very it's not a recipe for stability, I guess. And
no, it's a recipe for instability, because by keeping Russia on the outside of European security, what you've actually done is incentivize Russia to try to disrupt the order in Europe, which is what they've been doing. And that's not in anybody's interest, to create a situation where Russia has structural incentives to be a disruptor in the European theater.
Yeah, I'm always told this, that the Russians want to try to divide the Europeans and divide the West. And I usually respond, well, of course they do. This is why would you want a whole united bloc, economic bloc or military alliance allied against you? Of course you would sow divisions. But the problem, I think, goes deeper, though, because in Europe there's not any discussion really of what's considered to be actually legitimate Russian security concerns. If you speak about NATO or Russian security concerns, usually less than a second, someone will make references to Hitler and Munich and propaganda. And it's very dangerous because we can't really reduce the security competition unless we first recognize that our opponents actually have security interests. So why is it so difficult for the Europeans to discuss NATO expansion, as a security concern for the Russians?
Well, I think it's because of the particular paradigm, the conceptual model that Europeans are using to understand what Russia is doing and why. And I think they fully bought into what Robert Jervis called the deterrent model in understanding the nature of the Russian challenge. They regard Russia as the equivalent of Nazi Germany, an aggressor state which has decided it is going to launch wars of aggrandizement. They've decided to invade a neighbor in order to gain territory, rebuild empire, et cetera, and that this is entirely illegitimate, number one. And number two, the lesson of dealing with Nazi Germany, of course, is you don't appease, you don't seek some sort of compromise with an aggressor state, because that only feeds the appetite for more aggression. It only encourages the aggressor's belief that you're weak and unwilling to resist and push back. And so you don't use diplomacy in situations like that. You push back forcefully as necessary, to convince the aggressor state that it is not going to benefit in any way from aggression. And, at the risk of oversimplification, I would say that's exactly the conceptual model that Europe is using to try to understand the nature of the Russian challenge. And I think it's mistaken, actually. I think we're in a situation that is what Jervis called a spiral model problem, one in which one state is taking what it regards as defensive steps to enhance its own security, but these steps are perceived by another state as threatening, which prompts countermeasures that the second state thinks are defensive, and you get into a cycle of action and reaction, much like World War I, that results in crisis and conflict. And I think that is the dynamic that we have been in with Russia increasingly for several decades now. And the prescription for dealing with that kind of problem is diplomacy. If you approach this like a deterrence problem, when you're in an action-reaction escalation dynamic, you make the problem worse, not better. And I think that's exactly what has happened vis-a-vis Russia. It's playing out in Ukraine to quite devastating effects for the Ukrainians, but potentially quite devastating effects for Europe and the world should this continue. So for the Europeans to recognize that we're going to have to engage diplomatically with Russia and find some compromises and establish some rules of the game, we're actually going to have some serious discussions with the Europeans about this conceptual model, the framework that we use for understanding the nature of the problem we're facing. Until we have at least some rough understanding with the Europeans about the nature of the problem we're facing, we're not going to get very far in forging any kind of consensus about how to deal with it. And right now we're not engaging with Europe very effectively in how you understand the problem, and let alone what you do about it. So this is a period of time where we're going to have to step up our diplomatic interactions with the Europeans quite significantly.
Well, given that Europe more or less trapped itself in these narratives of unprovoked invasion, we're fighting the new Hitler, weapons are the path to peace, negotiation is appeasement. How do you have any historical, well, not necessarily reference, but lessons in terms of how to, I guess, punch a hole through these narratives? Does it have to come externally, you think, from the Americans to try to, well, pull the Europeans a bit out to recognizing, as you said, the security dilemma, that we do have a security competition which has to be mitigated?
Well, eventually over time, the Europeans may come around to this on their own. But the question is, do we have that time, and what type of acute crisis might arise in the interim that we would not be in a particularly good position to handle? I'm not sure that we can afford to wait. I think the United States is going to have to engage directly with Europe to help bring them around on this, because I don't think we have the luxury of time. And certainly Ukraine does not have the luxury of time. They are losing a war of attrition with Russia, and their situation is not going to get better with time. It's going to get worse. They're not suddenly going to find great large reserves of population that they haven't tapped into that they can send to the front lines. The combined industrial output of Europe, the United States, and Ukraine is not suddenly going to kick into high gear and outpace that of Russia, particularly in acutely important items like air defense systems, where there's a real problem in Ukraine and not much that the United States and Europe can do in the short term to fix that problem. So time is not on Ukraine's side, and we need to address this quite urgently.
And my last question is just what the United States will likely do if the Europeans are seen to sabotage the Americans' efforts to end the war, because it seems this coalition of the willing they're putting together. I'm not sure if this is going anywhere, but the discussions of sending troops into Ukraine, it appears to have the objective of undermining the ability to reach any ceasefire or peace agreement. And we saw that during the meeting now with Witkoff and Putin, they appear to cover two topics. One was normalizing U.S.-Russia relations, and the second was finding a solution to the Ukraine war. But if they happen to fail to reach an agreement on how to end the war, assume the normalization, will it still then continue? If so, what's happening? Is the U.S. going to go forward with working with Russia and push the Ukraine problem on the Europeans and wash its hands with it, or will this also hamper the normalization process? I know you don't have a crystal ball to look at, but what expectations do you have on the American side?
Well, this is going to depend to a great degree on to what degree the U.S. perceives Europe as having played a spoiler role in in the peace process in Ukraine. If we think that the Europeans have intentionally sabotaged things, that's going to prompt, I think, some pretty hard-line decisions on the part of Washington in how it deals with Europe. Now, I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope we're able to engage with Europe and bring them on board in helping to facilitate a peace process. I think we need them. If Ukraine is going to buy into a deal, I don't see Ukraine accepting a compromise with Russia unless they get something significant out of that deal. And I can't think of anything that they could get that would be more appealing than the prospect of membership in the European Union, which would be, anchoring Ukraine in the West politically, even though they're not going to be a member of the NATO alliance militarily. And it also holds out the prospect for, the return of refugees, at least in substantial numbers, to Ukraine, and it holds out the prospect of economic reconstruction for Ukraine. These are all things that Ukrainians could look at and say, well, we may not have recovered all the territory that Russia has occupied, but we have a viable path toward prosperous independence and anchoring in the West. Now, in order for that to happen, we need Europe to play that role. We need Europe to be working with Ukraine to help bring them into conformity with the acquis and facilitating all the reforms that are going to be necessary in Ukraine to join the EU, and also holding out that carrot, because that can have, I think, quite a catalytic effect in making a compromise with Russia realistic, one that Ukraine can buy into. But Europe has to agree that that's where we need to go in all of this, and that requires, in turn, I think, some pretty intense diplomatic engagement between the United States and Europe. Now, if we don't get a deal on Ukraine, if the United States sort of walks away and said, look, we've done our best, but key players in this process are simply not willing to compromise, we're moving on. I think that in turn puts real limits on how far U.S.-Russian rapprochement can advance. I think they're simply political realities that flow from a failed peace process in Ukraine that make it very difficult, that would make it very difficult, I think, for the Trump administration to pursue détente with Russia to any significant degree. There'd be an awful lot of opposition in Washington to, real improvements in the U.S.-Russian relationship in that kind of context.
Well, this is all going to be quite challenging at the moment in Europe, where I hear politicians speak of Russia have to be pushed back to the 1991 borders. They should pay reparations, and also, their political leadership should stand trial. So it's we're still far away, I think, but something appears to be changing in terms of recognizing that things aren't going the way they hoped. So.
Yeah, and I think Europe has to get realistic about what it can accomplish. It's one thing to say all these things are critical, we have to pursue justice in a settlement. It's another thing to ask yourself, do we actually have the capabilities that we need to bring about that kind of a settlement of this war? And I think the reality is that Europe is not even close to having the capabilities to achieve those sorts of outcomes that people are articulating. So there has to be a much bigger dose of realism in Europe's approach to this.
Well, George Beebe, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, and I hope to have you on again in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.